As we just saw in the last two videos of Peter Carava and Michael Soule, there's quite a contrast between the more traditional biocentric conservation approaches and the newer, more anthropocentric ones. On both sides of the debate, there are people who have strong feelings about their position and who will fight fiercely for what they believe in. In this video, we will take a deeper look at the debate that ensued in conservation after the introduction of the new conservation movement, and why and how the debate was eventually shut down. Let's start by quickly recapping the key arguments of the biocentric and anthropocentric approaches to conservation. The biocentric approach is rooted in the intrinsic value of nature, where non-humans matter irrespective of any instrumental or utilitarian value they may have for humans. It is also based on the key argument that natural communities function best without human interference, and that maintaining high ecological diversity and complexity is key to conserving nature and avoiding extinctions. Those who advocate for a biocentric approach to conservation believe that conservation and development are inherently incompatible. They believe that the way forward is to focus solely on what is best for nature, and that the way to do so is to establish strict protected areas that are meant to keep humans and nature separate. Although the biocentric approach to conservation does not allow humans to live in protected areas or to use them for extractive purposes, those who advocate for the approach will generally argue that strict, exclusionary protected areas can still bring considerable benefits to the people who live around them through increased ecotourism and the provision of ecosystem services. It's just that these benefits to people from protected areas are seen as a bonus, rather than something that is intentionally planned for. On the other hand, anthropocentric approaches to conservation are rooted in the instrumental value of nature, and the main focus is the benefits that humans receive from nature. The key argument is that conservation efforts are doomed to fail if they do not include local communities. Anthropocentric approaches to conservation largely emerged from the Millennium Development Goals, which were all about sustainable development and a balance between human use of the landscape and healthy ecosystems. Instead of strict protected areas, the main tool for conservation in the anthropocentric approach is integrated conservation and development projects, which intentionally include local communities and intentionally focus on their well-being. The belief is that the strict protected areas model, which excludes local communities, is both outdated and harmful. When Peter Carava and Michel Marvey published the paper What is Conservation Science in 2012, it set off a healthy, productive debate about the future of conservation, asking questions like, do corporations have a role in conservation? Should the focus be on intrinsic or instrumental value? And should conservation work towards human well-being? But what started off as a useful exercise quickly descended into vitriolic and personal battles, playing out in universities, conferences, research stations, conservation organizations, and the media. Some key quotes from some of the more prominent actors in this debate are shown here, with the more traditional folks in the yellow boxes and the new conservationists in the blue and purple boxes. People on both sides of the debate were fired up, and many saw it as being in a fight for the very soul of conservation. On the one side, you had the more traditional biocentric conservationists who were not ready to let go of their ideals, and who wanted conservation to remain rooted in the ideals of Michael Soule's 1985 paper, What is Conservation Biology, that we looked at earlier. These folks viewed the new conservationists as sellouts who just wanted to turn the whole world into a Disney-like garden. But on the other hand, the new conservationists viewed the more traditionalists as being stuck in their ways and a bit blind to reality, as humans already dominate the planet, and in their minds, conservation needs to be reflective of this. By 2014, just 2 years after the original paper presenting the ideals of the new conservation was published, the debate was completely unproductive, and many felt that it was doing more harm than good, and that more time was being spent on crafting insults rather than advancing solid arguments that would help to advance the field. Many conservationists on both sides of the debate had seen enough, but instead of calling for a change in tone to something a bit more civilized, most folks wanted to see it end completely. The most prominent of these calls came from Heather Tallis and Jane Lubchenco. Along with 238 co-signatories, they called for a more inclusive conservation in a paper which you can find in our supplementary readings this week. In it, they write that it was time to, quote, focus on synthesizing and expanding the evidence base that can identify what works and what fails in conservation so that we can move from philosophical debates to rigorous assessments of the effectiveness of actions, end quote. Their belief is that there is room for a multitude of values in conservation, and that the values of both biocentric and anthropocentric approaches to conservation should play a role in the future of conservation. They also do not believe that the two sides of the debates need to be in conflict with one another. Instead, they argue that the two approaches to conservation can actually be complementary, and that they can be used in different contexts to appeal to different audiences depending on the situation. For example, those who are on the more traditional, biocentric side of the debate often make the argument that by focusing on the ways by which people benefit from nature, we cheapen nature, and often overlook or completely miss opportunities to save those components of nature that have little to no obvious value to people. While this is a valid concern, those who defend the new conservation position will argue that the instrumental value of nature will always be a powerful argument for some audiences, and that it is a useful tactic for working to broaden the support of conservation initiatives. Essentially, there are all kinds of tools in the conservation toolbox, and we should use all of the tools at our disposal to work towards the shared vision of a thriving planet. Tallis and Lubchenco also pointed out that the debate around the new conservation was also quite pale-male and stale. The loudest voices, those who were getting the most attention and taking up the most space, were mainly older white men in senior level positions in universities and large conservation organizations. Missing from the debate were the voices of women and people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous women. Yes, many of the calls to find common ground in conservation came from women, including the paper we have been discussing here, but they were almost all white women. The voices of Black women, Indigenous women, and gender non-conforming folks were not really focused on or heard from throughout this debate, and that is a problem that persists in conservation today. And this is a really important factor to keep in mind as we discuss values and worldviews in conservation. If we truly want to have a conservation that makes room for everyone, we need to be conscious of whose voices we are choosing to listen to and whose have been historically overlooked or intentionally excluded. There were two main reasons why there were calls to shut down the debate around the new conservation rather than shift it to a more friendly tone. First, there was a desire to put efforts towards more meaningful on-the-ground action rather than philosophical debates in conference rooms. The second reason was that ultimately people on both sides wanted the same thing. They all wanted to protect biodiversity. So all of these debates over values and anthropocentrism versus biocentrism, it really didn't matter. So many were quick to want to move away from this debate because they felt it was slowing down progress towards real conservation action. Remember back to Michael Soule's plea for an action-based conservation biology. His vision was a scientific discipline focused on changing the world, focused on working towards the conservation of nature in the real world. Remember that conservation is a discipline with a deadline, and there isn't a second to wait. Biologists have to work now towards a conservation action. Although it has been over 40 years since Soule gave that speech, the sense of urgency and the desire for action remains strong amongst conservationists. In fact, many people find their way to working in conservation because of their love of nature and because they want to work towards its protection. So it isn't really surprising that given this history, people in conservation see the stakes as being really high, and they want to see action and change on the ground. Essentially, this history and culture in conservation meant a debate on philosophical values was viewed as a distraction from what really matters: action. This argument is summed up really well by this quote here from Elena Bennett, who is an ecologist at McGill University. Her view is that really important work was stalled by a philosophical debate that doesn't need to happen. She said, quote, "We don't have 10 years and probably don't even have 5 years to sit around and have that debate. We really need to move now," end quote. This sense of urgency that characterized conservation biology in the early days has never really gone away, and it was a factor on both sides of the debate. Both sides wanted so badly to see positive conservation outcomes, but they saw the other side as hampering or even counteracting their efforts. But ultimately, both sides wanted to see action on the ground to work towards the protection of biodiversity. So talking about why conservation matters and what we value in conservation was seen to be a waste of time. Both sides were fundamentally for the same thing, biodiversity conservation. But there are questions as to how unifying the goal of biodiversity conservation really is, as it isn't as simple as it's often made out to be. Remember back to the first week when we defined the core goal of biodiversity conservation as to protect and maintain the viability of all living organisms and the ecological complexes they are a part of in perpetuity. This is obviously a huge task, and the reality is that it is impossible to conserve all biodiversity, as there are limited resources to put towards conservation, and a big part of conservation in practice is working to figure out how to best direct these limited resources. At the global level, a number of different schemes have been developed to identify places to prioritize for conservation. 9 of these priority schemes are shown here on the screen. As you can see, each of these maps identify different areas as being critical for conservation. This is because they all identify priority areas based on different factors. Some of these schemes, like endemic bird areas here in the top right, are more focused on identifying highly irreplaceable areas. Those areas with highly unique biodiversity, areas with a lot of species that are found nowhere else in the world. Other schemes are more focused on identifying areas that are highly vulnerable, those areas where biodiversity is at risk of disappearing. An example of this is the crisis ecoregions, which is the map here in the top left. One important thing to point out here is that if we were to combine all of these different priority setting exercises into one map, a huge chunk of the planet would be identified as a conservation priority. In fact, collectively, just these 9 shown here highlight 79% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. Realistically, this is far more than we can ever dream to protect, and there are so many more factors that go into directing conservation resources. And ultimately, where we choose to direct those resources and where we do not is a matter of values. When it comes down to it, someone who is more of a biocentrist will choose to allocate limited resources in a different way than someone who takes a more anthropocentric approach to conservation. And that's okay. There are so many different perspectives in conservation, and if the new conservation debate has taught us anything, it is that they're not really going anywhere. So the question is, how do we create a field that supports all of these different perspectives, plus make space for those voices and perspectives that were largely shut out of the public debate? This is a complicated question and one that the field is still grappling with, but we will explore some of the paths forward in the next video.